What does rock bottom sound like? For David Morrison, it was the buzz of fluorescent lights in a hospital room and the metallic click of handcuffs against a bed railing. He opened his eyes to harsh white light that felt like needles in his skull. His mouth tasted like copper and vomit. The room spun, even though he was lying still. A police officer sat in the corner, arms crossed, watching him with the flat expression of someone who'd seen this before. David tried to move. The handcuff rattled. Cold metal bit into his wrist. He had no memory of how he got here. The door opened and a nurse walked in, rubber-soled shoes squeaking on linoleum. She checked the IV drip without meeting his eyes, her movements efficient and practiced. "You're awake," she said. Her voice carried no warmth, no judgment, just fact. "You wrapped your truck around a telephone pole on Route 9 last night. Blood alcohol was 3 times the legal limit." David closed his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids swirled with fragments he couldn't piece together. A gas station, headlights, the sound of metal screaming. "You're lucky you didn't kill anyone," the nurse continued. She finally met his gaze. "Your sister is outside. She says this is your last chance." The nurse left without waiting for a response. The fluorescent lights continued their relentless buzzing. Rachel walked in 20 minutes later. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her jaw was set in a way David recognized from their childhood. It was the look she'd had when their father left, the expression that meant she would survive this even if it broke her. She stood at the foot of the bed and didn't come closer. "I'm done," she said. Her voice shook but didn't break. "I've watched you destroy yourself for 15 years. I've lied to Emma and Sophie about why their father can't see them. I've bailed you out and cleaned you up and made excuses until I don't recognize myself anymore." She gripped the bed railing, her knuckles white. "So here's what happens now. You go to New Hope Recovery, or I walk out of this room and you never hear from me again. You won't die alone with me watching," she added. "Choose." David wanted to argue. The words lined up in his throat. Excuses and promises and bargains he'd made 1,000 times before. But his tongue felt thick and useless. He stared at his sister's face and saw something he'd never seen before. She meant it. This was the end. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." 10 years earlier, David Morrison had been a different man. He'd been a construction foreman, with calloused hands and a reputation for running tight crews. He'd owned a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs with Amy and the girls. Emma had been 4. Sophie barely 2. Weekends meant backyard barbecues and soccer games, and Amy's laugh when he'd sneak up behind her in the kitchen. The drinking had been social at first. Beers with the crew after work, whiskey on Friday nights. It was what men did. It was controlled, manageable, just a way to unwind after 10-hour days in the sun and dust. Then Tommy fell from the scaffolding. David had been the one to call 911, the one to hold pressure on the wound while they waited for the ambulance. Tommy lived, but he'd never work construction again. David replayed that morning in his head for months. The measurements, the safety checks, the wind that had picked up right before the accident. He'd been the foreman. He'd been responsible. The beer after work became 3 beers, then 5, then whiskey before bed, to silence the thoughts. Amy noticed. She started watching him the way you watch something fragile, waiting for it to break. "It's getting worse," she said one night, her voice careful. "Maybe you should talk to someone." David had promised. He'd cut back. He stayed dry for a week, maybe 2. Then the cravings would claw their way up his throat, and he'd stop at the liquor store on the way home. Just this once. Just to take the edge off. The job ended first. He showed up to a site drunk at 8 in the morning, slurring instructions that could have gotten someone killed. The company let him go without questions. They'd seen it before, too. Amy left 3 months later. She took Emma and Sophie and moved in with her mother across town. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. David signed them at the kitchen table with a bottle of Jack Daniels open beside him. The house went to Amy in the settlement. David moved into a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and old cigarettes. The years blurred after that, days bled into nights. Bottles piled up beside the trash can because he couldn't remember which day pickup was. Rachel called every week. Eventually, he stopped answering. His phone stayed face down on the coffee table, vibrating with calls he wouldn't take. Then came the night on Route 9. The gas station where he bought another bottle, even though his palms were slick with sweat. The dark road stretching out ahead of him. The telephone pole that appeared out of nowhere, sudden and inevitable as fate. New Hope Recovery sat on 20 acres of wooded property 40 minutes outside town. Rachel drove him there 3 days after the hospital. David watched the trees slide past the window and said nothing. His body trembled without alcohol. Every cell in him screamed for just one drink. The main building was old brick with white trim, probably a school once, or maybe a church. Men sat on the front porch in plastic chairs, talking in low voices. They glanced up when Rachel parked but didn't stare. David's stomach twisted. This was where people went when they'd lost everything. This was where he belonged now. A man in his late 50s met them at the door. He had weathered skin and graying hair pulled back in a short ponytail. His palms were scarred and strong when he shook David's hand. He introduced himself as James. "Welcome," he said. "I drank for 23 years. Been sober for 9? Stick around." Rachel hugged David at the entrance. Her arms were tight around him, and he felt her crying against his shoulder, but she didn't speak. When she pulled back, she wiped her eyes quickly and strode to her car without another glance. David watched her taillights disappear down the long driveway. "Come on," James said. "Let me show you around." The program had structure. 6 o'clock wake up every morning. Breakfast in the common room at 6:30. The smell of coffee and oatmeal, and 30 men trying to remember how to live. Morning devotional at 7, everyone sitting in folding chairs while the chaplain read from scripture and talked about surrender. David sat in the back and studied the floor. Work therapy started at 8. David got assigned to the garden, a half-acre plot behind the main building where they grew vegetables for the kitchen. The dirt was dark and rich, and got under his fingernails. The physical labor felt good. It kept him busy. It kept his mind from counting the hours since his last drink. Counseling sessions happened after lunch. One-on-one meetings where a soft-spoken man named Marcus asked questions David didn't want to answer. "Tell me about your daughters," Marcus said during the first session. David's throat closed up. He stared at the wall and gave no reply. "That's okay," Marcus said. "We've got time." Afternoons meant group therapy in a circle of mismatched chairs. Men shared their stories, voices breaking on words like relapse and prison and homeless. David listened but didn't speak. He didn't know these people. He didn't want to know them. Evenings were free time, reading, or walks around the property or chapel for those who wanted it. David went back to his room, a small space with a twin bed and a desk, and a window overlooking the pine trees. He lay on the narrow mattress and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the liquor store 3 miles down the road. At night, the cravings came worst. They hit like a fist to the chest, sudden and vicious. David would lie awake with his fists clenched and his jaw tight, every cell in his body demanding alcohol. The first week, he barely slept. The second week, he thought about leaving. The third week, he packed his bag at 2 in the morning. He made it to the front door before James found him. James stood in the hallway in sweatpants and an old flannel shirt, feet bare on the wooden floor. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Come walk with me." They crossed the property in darkness, gravel crunching under their feet. The air smelled like pine, and earth, and rain that hadn't fallen yet. Above them, stars scattered across the sky in patterns David had forgotten existed. James moved with his palms in his pockets, unhurried, like they had all night. "I showed up drunk to a custody hearing," James said after a while. His voice was soft but firm. "My ex-wife was asking for full custody, and I showed up drunk." The judge didn't even deliberate. He gave her everything and told me I was lucky he wasn't holding me in contempt. "I haven't seen my son in 12 years. David said nothing. His bag hung heavy on his shoulder. They passed the garden where David spent his mornings, past the chapel with its small steeple barely visible against the night sky. James stopped at a wooden bench near the edge of the property, where the trees grew thick. He sat down and gestured for David to join him. "The wreckage appears different," James said, "but the road is the same. You can leave tonight. Walk down that driveway and find what you're looking for. Your thirst will follow you." He turned to face David directly. "Or you can stay and learn to be thirsty for something else." David set his bag down. He sat on the bench and put his head in both palms. His shoulders shook, but no sound came out. James didn't touch him, didn't offer empty comfort. He just sat there, solid and present, a man who'd traveled this road before. They stayed on that bench until the sky started to lighten, until the first birds began calling from the trees. Then James stood up and held out his palm. "Come on," he said. "Let's get some coffee before devotional." David left his bag by the bench. He followed James back to the main building. After that night, something changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. David started paying attention in chapel. He listened when the chaplain talked about surrender, about admitting powerlessness, about finding strength beyond yourself. The words still felt foreign, like a language he'd never learned. But James believed them. James was sober. So David kept listening. He started praying, though he wasn't sure who he was praying to. Late at night when the cravings hit, he'd kneel beside his bed and whisper into the darkness, "I can't do this. I can't do this. I need help." The words felt awkward and desperate, like shouting into a void. But sometimes, afterward, the fist in his chest would loosen just enough to let him breathe. In group therapy, he finally spoke. Week 5, sitting in that circle of broken men, David opened his mouth and heard himself say, "I destroyed everything I loved." The words hung in the air. His palms shook. He waited for judgment, for pity, for the disgust he felt toward himself. "Me too," said the man across from him, a guy named Carl with tattoos running up both forearms. Then another voice, "Me too." Around the circle, heads nodded. These men knew. They'd sat where he was sitting. They'd lost what he'd lost. Marcus smiled slightly. "That's a start," he said. The men became his lifeline. When cravings hit during free time, David would find James working in the garden, or Carl pacing the property, or Deshaun reading on the porch. They'd sit with him. They wouldn't preach or fix him. They'd just be present. Solid anchors in a world that still felt like it was spinning. David got assigned to kitchen duty on weekends. He learned to measure coffee for 30 men, to crack 5 dozen eggs for breakfast, to scrub industrial pots until his palms were raw. The routine mattered. Every hour accounted for meant one less hour thinking about drinking. James sat with him during lunch most days. They'd talk about small things. The weather, the vegetables coming up in the garden, sports neither of them followed anymore. Sometimes they'd discuss harder things. James told stories about his son, about the birthday parties he'd missed, about the baseball games where his seat stayed empty. I write him letters, James said. I don't know if he reads them, but I write them anyway, just so he knows I'm thinking about him, that I'm sorry. Do you think he'll forgive you? David asked. James was silent for a long moment. I don't know, he finally said. But I can't earn forgiveness by drinking. So I stay sober, and I write letters, and I trust that God is working even when I can't see it. David thought about Emma and Sophie. He hadn't seen them in 8 months. Rachel sent updates occasionally. Emma made honor roll. Sophie joined the soccer team. The updates felt like knives, small slices of the life he wasn't part of anymore. Maybe I could write to them, David said. James nodded. Yeah, maybe you could. That night, David sat at the desk in his room with a blank piece of paper. He wrote, Dear Emma and Sophie at the top, and stared at the empty space below. What could he possibly say? I'm sorry felt inadequate. I love you felt like a lie from someone who'd chosen alcohol over them again and again. He wrote, I'm in a place where I'm learning to be better. It's hard, I fail a lot. But I'm trying. I think about you every day. He folded the paper and put it in an envelope. He gave it to Rachel during visiting hours on Sunday. She took it without comment and promised to pass it along. David didn't ask if they'd read it. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Day 73, the chaplain talked about grace during morning devotional. Not the grace you earn, he said, standing at the front of the room with his worn Bible open. The grace that finds you when you've got nothing left to give. When you're empty and broken and sure you're beyond saving. That's when grace shows up. David sat in the back row as usual, but this time he listened. He thought about the nights he'd prayed without believing anyone heard. He thought about James sitting with him on that bench in the darkness. He thought about the men in group therapy who'd said, me too. Maybe that was grace. Not a lightning bolt. Not a dramatic rescue. Just people showing up. Just one more morning sober. After devotional, David entered the chapel alone. It was empty and hushed. Sunlight streaming through the plain windows onto the wooden pews worn smooth from years of use. He sat in the back and let the stillness settle around him. He didn't have words for a prayer. He just sat there, palms open on his knees, and let himself breathe. Week 12. David's counselor Marcus asked, Are you ready for a family visit? David's stomach dropped. I don't know. They want to see you, Marcus said. Rachel called. Emma and Sophie asked. The visit was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. David barely slept the night before. He woke at 5 and couldn't eat breakfast. He changed shirts 3 times. He couldn't make his palms stop shaking. James found him pacing outside the common room at noon. You're gonna be fine, James said. Just be honest. Just be present. That's all you can do. David nodded but didn't believe him. Rachel's car pulled up at 1 o'clock. David watched from the window as his daughters climbed out. Emma was 14 now, taller than he remembered, with her mother's eyes and careful way of moving. Sophie was 11, wearing pink sneakers and a soccer jersey. She appeared so much older than the toddler, he remembered that David's chest tightened. They moved toward a picnic table on the lawn. The wood was warm from the sun, splintered in places. Rachel hugged David briefly, and then stepped back to give them space. She sat at another table nearby, watchful but not hovering. Hi, David said. His voice came out rough. Hi, Emma replied softly. Sophie just stared at her shoes. They sat down. The silence stretched out, awkward and painful. David wanted to fill it with apologies and explanations and promises, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, Emma asked, How are you? I'm okay, David said. I'm learning a lot. Working in the garden. He gestured vaguely toward the plot behind the building. We grow vegetables. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too formal, like he was talking to strangers. Sophie scuffed her pink sneaker against the grass. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Sophie scored 3 goals last week, Emma offered. She's really good. That's amazing, David said, turning toward his younger daughter. Sophie's jaw was tight. She picked at a splinter on the picnic table and gave no response. Are you getting better? Emma asked suddenly. The question hung in the air between them. David studied his palms. They were calloused from garden work, dirt still under his fingernails even though he'd scrubbed them. They were stable for the first time in years. I'm trying, he said. Every single day, I'm trying. Sophie finally raised her eyes. They were wet, but she didn't cry. She just watched him, measuring, deciding whether to believe. After a long moment, she nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't trust, but it was something. They stayed for an hour. The conversation remained careful, full of safe topics like school and soccer and the weather. When Rachel announced it was time to go, Emma hugged him. The embrace was brief and uncertain, but it was real. Sophie waved from the car. David watched them drive away and felt something crack open in his chest. James found him sitting alone at the picnic table 20 minutes later. How'd it go? He asked. David wiped his eyes quickly. It went okay. James sat down beside him. That's good. That's a start. David completed the 90-day program. On his last day, the men gathered in the common room for a small ceremony. The chaplain said a prayer. James presented him with a coin marking 3 months sober. It was small and bronze and felt heavy in David's palm. You've done good work here, James said. But the real work starts now, out there. He gestured toward the windows, toward the world beyond the property. Stay connected. Come to meetings. Call your sponsor. Don't try to do this alone. David moved into a sober living house in town, a 3-bedroom place with 5 other men in recovery. The house had strict rules, random drug tests, mandatory meetings, curfews. David didn't mind. The structure helped. The accountability mattered. He got a job at a lumber yard, loading trucks and cutting boards to specification. The work was physical and straightforward. He liked the smell of sawdust and the weight of wood in his grip. He liked coming home tired enough to sleep without the cravings keeping him awake. He attended AA meetings 3 times a week. Tuesday and Thursday nights at the church basement on Elm Street, where folding chairs scraped against tile and coffee burned in the corner pot. Sunday afternoons at the community center, fluorescent lights humming overhead, while men and women shared their stories. He got a sponsor named Robert, a retired electrician with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, who'd been sober for 16 years. Robert's phone number went into David's wallet and got programmed into his phone and got written on a slip of paper taped to his bathroom mirror. When the cravings came, and they still came, sudden and vicious, David would call. Sometimes they'd talk for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Sometimes Robert would just stay on the line, breathing on the other end, a reminder that David wasn't alone in the dark. He started attending church on Sunday mornings. Not because he had all the answers, not because he'd had some dramatic conversion moment, but because he'd learned he couldn't stay sober alone. Because sitting in those pews with other people who were trying, who were failing and trying again, felt like being part of a body larger than his own brokenness. He called Emma and Sophie every Tuesday and Thursday evening. The conversations were still careful, still awkward. Emma told him about school projects and friend drama. Sophie talked about soccer games and her art class. They didn't ask about his recovery. He didn't push. The fact that they answered the phone felt like enough. 6 months sober, David sat in Robert's truck outside Amy's house. Emma had invited him to her 9th grade band concert. Amy had agreed, cautiously, to let him come. David gripped the steering wheel. He hadn't seen Amy in 2 years. "You ready?" Robert asked. He'd driven over to provide moral support. "No," David said. "But I'm going anyway." Robert smiled. That's usually how it works. The concert was in the high school auditorium. David sat in the back row. Amy was up front with Sophie, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail he remembered from years ago. She turned when he entered, a long measuring look. But she didn't smile and she didn't wave. David understood. He'd burned that bridge thoroughly. If there was any way back across it, he'd have to build it himself, brick by brick. Emma played clarinet in the third row. She was focused and serious, following the conductor with careful attention. When the band finished their final piece, David clapped until his palms hurt. Emma found him in the lobby afterward. She appeared nervous, glancing between him and her mother. "You came," she said. "I wouldn't have missed it," David told her. Amy appeared beside Sophie, her hand protectively on their younger daughter's shoulder. "Hello, David," she said. Her voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "Amy, thank you for letting me come." She nodded once. "Emma wanted you here." They stood in an awkward triangle while other families flowed around them. Finally, Amy said, "You look better." "I'm trying," David said. "I'm 6 months sober. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know She held up her hand. "I don't need promises. I need consistency. If you're going to be in their lives, you need to show up. Not just tonight. Every time." "I will," David said. "I want to." Amy studied his face for a long moment. "Then we'll see," she said. She took the girls by the hand and moved toward the parking lot. Emma glanced back once and gave him a small smile. David stood in the emptying auditorium and let himself breathe. 1 year sober, David went back to New Hope Recovery. Not as a resident, as a volunteer. James had suggested it months earlier. "We need people who've been where these men are," he'd said. "People who can speak their language." Think about it. David thought about it. Then he called Marcus and asked what he needed to do. The training was simple. Mostly it was just showing up, being present, listening without trying to fix. David started leading a men's group on Wednesday nights. 8 to 10 guys sitting in a circle, talking about cravings and failures and small victories. He shared his story. He told them about the hospital and the handcuffs and Rachel's ultimatum. He told them about the night he tried to leave, and James brought him back. He told them what James had told him. You can leave, but your thirst will follow you, or you can stay and learn to be thirsty for something else. Some of the men listened, some didn't, some left after a week, some stayed. David kept showing up every Wednesday. He kept sharing his story. He kept believing that someone in that circle needed to hear it. A man named Carlos approached him after group one night. Carlos was 26, skinny and trembling, 3 days into the program. "Your story," Carlos said. "About your daughters. Did they forgive you?" David was silent for a moment. "I don't know if forgive is the right word," he said. "We're building something new. It's slow. Some days it feels impossible." He met Carlos's eyes directly. "But they answer my calls now. Emma had dinner at my apartment last month. Sophie sent me a drawing she made in art class. It's not what it was, but it's something." Carlos nodded, his eyes wet. "That's what I want, just something." "Then stick around," David said. "Do the work. It won't be fast, and it won't be easy. But it's possible." 18 months sober, Emma came to David's apartment for dinner. He'd been terrified to suggest it, certain she'd say no. But she'd agreed. He'd spent 3 hours cleaning and another hour at the grocery store trying to remember what she liked. They made pasta together in his small kitchen. Emma chopped vegetables while David boiled water. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally bumping elbows in the cramped space. David's refrigerator held a photo of the girls, the corners curling slightly. Emma noticed it but didn't comment. Over dinner, they talked about her plans for college. She wanted to study environmental science. She showed him photos on her phone of national parks she hoped to visit. Yosemite with its granite cliffs, Yellowstone with its geysers, the red rocks of Zion. David listened and asked questions and felt a cautious joy that still scared him with its fragility. When she left, Emma hugged him at the door. This time the embrace lasted longer. "Thanks for dinner, Dad," she said. "Anytime," David told her. His voice cracked on the word. "Anytime at all." She moved toward her car and waved before getting in. David stood in the doorway and watched her taillights disappear down the street. He thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, waking up in a hospital bed with handcuffs on his wrist. He thought about James sitting beside him on that bench in the darkness. He thought about the Wednesday night groups and the men who were just starting this road. Recovery wasn't a lightning bolt. It was 1,000 small choices to stay when everything screamed to run. It was showing up on Wednesday nights and calling your sponsor and attending church even when you didn't feel like it. It was digging in the garden and answering the phone and making pasta with your daughter in a cramped kitchen. It was learning to be thirsty for something else. David still attends meetings. He still calls Robert when the cravings hit. He still volunteers at New Hope Recovery every Wednesday night, leading groups for men who sit in the back and count the days. He tells them his story. He tells them about James and the bench, and the morning he stopped running. He tells them, grace isn't a lightning bolt. Sometimes it's just people showing up. Sometimes it's one more morning sober. Sometimes it's your daughter calling you dad. The road is long, and it's hard, and some days David still wants to run. But he's learned something in these 2 years. He's learned that miracles aren't always dramatic rescues. Sometimes they're hushed mornings when you wake up sober, call your daughters, and choose to keep moving forward. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply trying again.